Well, good afternoon, Peter. Thanks for coming over, and
My
I
pleasure.
appreciate you doing this, especially knowing that you've got a trip to Boone coming up this weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Say a quick word about that. I know you have a role with a synagogue. Is that right, up in Boone or
First year
community?
it's a synagogue.
First year, okay.
It's the 24th year I've led the High Holy Days for the Boone Jewish community, which is now the Temple of the High Country because they built a synagogue in
Right.
downtown Boone. And this will be the first year that they have the High Holy Days there. Past 20 years it's been in the Catholic Church that has been wonderful to us. And I've just been, ever since I was teaching up in Boone in 88 through 90, I was leading from 89 straight through till this year.
I know this weekend marks the start of the Jewish New Year.
Sunday night will be Sunday night, Monday, and conservative Jews and Orthodox celebrate Tuesday as well for the New Year, Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh Hashanah. Well, good. Well, again, thanks for doing this in advance of this
Sure.
weekend. And say a quick word about your responsibilities at Clemson. I know we have a lot of students within our Wesley group and at the Methodist Church here who've had you as professor on campus, but others who have not and hopefully will before they leave. But say a word about your
Sure.
responsibilities.
My day job is teaching in the philosophy and religion department. I teach the Gen Ed courses, Intro to Religion, World Religions. And I'm the faculty advisor for Hillel Jewish Student Association. I am one of the people, and your students will love to hear this, in charge of the e-portfolio on campus. So if they need any help with the cross-cultural awareness, come by my office. That's my area. This year, for the first time, I am the faculty advisor for the women's softball team. Faculty advisor for students for religious dialogue, and just about anything else anyone asks me to do.
Okay. As I told you, we're beginning this series on Sunday nights that's centering around looking at how the Old Testament kind of unfolds, the narrative as it unfolds. So we're going to look at some of the key stories that you find in Genesis and Exodus and so on in the Old Testament, but in particular, we're going to be looking at and doing a study of the different covenants throughout the Old Testament. So, in general terms, how do Jews typically see that covenant history? How they view it?
Okay. Well, first of all, they don't call it the Old Testament.
Exactly.
They call it the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, which is an abbreviation for Torah, prophets, and holy writings. The word testament actually means covenant, pretty much. And it's from an English legal term that means agreement between two people. And they see the idea of covenant as a relationship, an immediate relationship with the people of Israel and their God, who becomes known as Adonai. That's his name. Eloheinu is our God, so he's the specific God of the people. And they, over time, join in the covenant and ultimately become the children of Israel through being the children of Jacob, whose name becomes Israel. And it's this relationship all the way through history and through the law that's given that really measures who a Jew is, where they are as far as Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Reconstructionist, or whatever their interpretation of the law. It's just a sweeping view of it.
Right. And when you look at the covenants, you mentioned earlier that the typical Jewish perspective is to look at the covenant with Abraham as kind of as central to the whole narrative.
Right. And it really is important because it's the commonality between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the Abrahamic faith, that actually Monday morning we read from the 22nd chapter of Genesis, where the covenant is actually formed. Abraham is told to sacrifice his son. A small difference between Christianity and Judaism, Abraham is seen as the person of faith, who is, what does Kierkegaard say, the knight of faith, I think, or something like that. Whereas the Jews see him as the person who does as he's commanded, who is willing to do what is asked of him without asking a question. And when he does offer his son, there's a wonderful conversation between first a third-person discussion with an angel that becomes a first-person discussion with God. That because you have done these things, because you have withheld your son, your only son, your precious son Isaac, I will now multiply your descendants, etc., etc. And this is really the covenant right there that begins the majority of what we now call Judaism, but for hundreds of years was the children of Israel.
Right. I know early on when I was probably in Sunday school growing up, I remember one of my teachers talking about the difference between a covenant and a contract. Say a word about that.
I'm not sure there is a difference.
Okay.
It'd be interesting to hear what you have to say about it. For Jews, it is a contract between God and the people, but it's also between the people and each other. Especially this time of the year, there's a wonderful statement in the High Holy Day Prayer Book that one is not forgiven for their sins against God until they are forgiven for their sins against their fellow men. And they have to literally admit to them and ask for forgiveness for each other. The contract is, it is a contract that must be agreed to for a male, signed by blood, which is a whole big deal now in Germany with circumcision.
Right.
But that's the mark of that Brit Milah, the
physical mark
covenant of the flesh,
right.
Which becomes in the New Testament. Paul does a play on those words very well. He says it's a covenant of the heart,
right.
Which is actually quoted from Jeremiah later on, that it's not important the physical, what's important is in here.
Right.
What did she say different about her?
Well, I can't remember how it was described, but I think it was, maybe it had to do with this notion of being entered into voluntarily, or I'm not sure how that was tied in possibly. Typically in a contract there's remuneration, and you do this and I'll do this and so on, but
there's a lot of stories the rabbis tell about how Israel became, quote unquote, the chosen people, and it's not because they're better. One of them is just a wonderful aside. It says, "We will do and we will hearken," in Exodus when Moses brings him the law, which is a very odd order. We'll do it. What is it? And it's that God has offered it to every single nation in the world, and they refused it because of strings attached, whatever. And when God came to the last group, the children of Israel, he picked up Mount Sinai, held it over their head, and said, if you do it, everything will be fine. If you don't, that's going to be your grave. So the idea of chosenness is for a purpose, not for specialness, but certainly voluntarily, after that. A decision has to be made.
right.
And I see the real decision made in the 6th book of the Bible, in Joshua, the 24th chapter, when Joshua, all the tribes are together, and he says, as for me and my house, we will worship the Lord. It's decision time.
Right.
Are you going to be there or here?
Right.
And really through the Bible, before that, it's individuals, it's groups making decisions. Now it becomes an individual and real bond between them.
Right. I know we typically talk about the Abraham covenant, and that story is this notion of how Abraham's and his descendants have been blessed in order to be a blessing. And that kind of, I guess, echoes part of what you're saying about what it means to be the covenant people.
Sure.
To be in this special relationship, not because you're special, but in order that the God of all things might be made known to
Right,
to all
be a light
people.
unto the nations in Isaiah.
Right.
And one of the things it says is, you shall be exceedingly blessed, right in that. And you shall obtain or hold on to the gates of your enemies, which means basically having control of their gates, their cities, and the land is mentioned, descendants are mentioned, everything a nomadic people would want. And that really is the major statement. Of course, Noah's covenant is important, and it's kind of like, let's start over. Let's
Right.
do this the right way. But Abraham's is the central one because we have the patriarchs now, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and literally the children of Israel are the children of Jacob. And the way I explain it to my classes is it's a romanticized history
Right.
of the tribes all being connected to Abraham, and it probably isn't that clean or that beautiful, but it's the connection right on down the line to that incident or that command up on Mount Moriah.
So in the scriptures where it talks about the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is that kind of echo of that?
Sure.
Echo of the covenant, and echo of that larger narrative then?
And an important part of that is Jews do not see, I would say the vast majority, that there's any type of personal afterlife at this time in the Bible. It's memory. It's remembrance of people. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob become remembered through prayers in your church, in our synagogue, in a mosque. It becomes, and they're actually seen as prophets in Islam. Jews don't see them as prophets, they see them as the patriarchs. And it's this idea that they are the foundation, you
Right.
might say.
Right. As I mentioned, we're going to this semester we're going to look at not only the covenant with Abraham, and we're going to look at the other covenants as well that you find in the Old Testament. They mentioned of Noah, the Noah covenant, and they mentioned of the Jeremiah covenant as well. Do you have any thoughts or things you'd add about any of the other covenants you might find?
Jeremiah's is very important, and Paul presents it in such a way and connects it beautifully in the first century. What Jeremiah is saying, or hoping, which doesn't happen, is that the externals of the religion, of the tradition, are gone. You can't depend on the temple, or won't be able to depend upon the temple anymore. He's prophesying about its destruction. And it's his hope that the people will turn inward and not depend upon outward things like a circumcision of the flesh or objects or things of that sort. And it's going to just be a renaissance for the people, which doesn't really happen at that point. Paul picks up on it, and beautifully it becomes that kind of idea, circumcision of the heart, that now we've got the non-Jews who don't have to be circumcised, who don't need to know the tradition. It's open to them as well, as long as they have the same ideas, that can accept the teachings of Jesus, etc. And it kind of like skips a generation, but it's the same idea that Jeremiah is hoping for in the 6th century, that doesn't come to be.
And I know Jeremiah speaks of this notion of it's not written on tablets, but it's written on the heart.
Exactly.
Written on the
Yes.
heart, which echoes, of course, the Moses story. How does the Moses story in the Jewish tradition, how does that story connect with the Abraham story?
Okay. There's so many different ways. Moses is seen as this individual first that, typical of a person or a prophet, does not want the job, tries everything he can do to get out of it, gets saddled with it, and ultimately he ends up going up on the mountain, comes back, and first thing that happens is the ancient Israelites, again, they're not worshiping one God, they're worshiping an idol. They still haven't gotten it. There's a lot of different traditions. The Orthodox say he wrote down every word of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Reform believes that it's a tradition, a remembrance of the people, whatever. Moses is a link between the people prior to the Exodus, and he's not led in the land because he doesn't listen to God. The case of hitting his staff on the rock rather than just speaking to it. He's allowed to look in, but not go in. And it's very interesting in the more conservative and Orthodox Haggadahs, the stories told at Passover, Moses' name isn't even mentioned. It's God who's the central character. Moses is a tool, the conduit of God, and that's what prophets are anyway in the Hebrew Bible. But he is the one that has given the people originally these 10 commandments. Clearly after Exodus, when you get into Leviticus, and even if you just think about it, no community can live on 10 commandments, and they're built on immediately to 613 in the Jewish tradition. But he is seen as this direct link with God, direct relationship with God, who has brought the law to the people, who has brought them the priesthood through his brother Aaron, and has gotten them to the land that was promised to them.
And so the law and the laws and the priesthood and all that surrounds that is again a further kind of manifestation of this notion of being a blessing, light unto the nations. So
right. This is not for the children of Israel. Mm-hmm. This is for everyone, and God is for everyone, and the teachings are for everyone, and the laws are for everyone, and it's the choice of anyone who wants to come in.
Right. Of course, having studied some of the other ancient religions that existed at the time, I know there's much within Judaism that you can find in other religions of the time, but there's other things that are very distinctive that were unique to Judaism at the time, or the early roots of Judaism. What are some of those things that you find in the covenant or in the law that really differentiated them against, say, the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the others of the day?
The statement, "You shall be holy because your God shall be holy. You shall be a holy nation." That statement is saying you shall be different. That's the word holy really comes from, different, separate, set apart. And many of the laws, people go, why are they there? One of my professors in grad school had this wonderful concept that they're there for cultic purity. They do this, no, you do that. And many of them, the law, for instance, beginning of the kosher laws, which probably has nothing to do with food. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. This was probably in reference to the Canaanites who did sacrifice their children. But it's very clear, any time that the children of Israel want to be like the other people, God is not happy. When they ask for a king, he is not a happy camper.
Right.
He tells them, aren't I enough? I've done this for you. And if you do have a king, this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. No, we want a king. He wants them different. He wants them special. Again, as an example, not as anything more than that.
If we fast forward kind of into our modern kind of time, obviously the circumcision continues to be a physical kind of manifestation of the covenant, so to speak. But and again, I guess it depends on the tradition within Judaism. But how would a typical Jew think of how is that covenant kind of lived out every day in our own day and time?
Well, first thing, there's no typical Jew. There's
no
typical Methodist
no
or
typical
whatever.
Christian, exactly.
Many Jews don't circumcise their males anymore because they think it's barbaric, and it is in many ways a barbaric exercise. And it's what's in here that's important, how they live their lives. And the word law comes from the word to walk. It's how you walk, what you do that's important. Example I give my classes, if someone walked up to a very special person in the first century named Joshua, not Jesus, but the same person, and said, okay, I came from the 21st century. I got a question for you. What do you really believe? He probably wouldn't understand the question. What he does and why he does it is the measure, even in the first century, of a Jew, rather than what they believe, how they live their life to be an example for their families and other people. And you'll see, just like any other group, the whole spectrum of Some people will not drive on the Sabbath. Some people will work on the Sabbath. Some people will keep a kosher home. Some of those people will eat out.
You're right.
It's just like any other culture.
Right. So it's a wide range of practices.
Definitely.
But
In many ways, it's also cultural. You know, it's
Right.
very much, Judaism is very much more than just a narrow religion. It's very cultural in how it relates to its history and whatnot.
and I guess arguably that maybe the tie that binds those different traditions together is this notion of a life well lived, a life that reflects
Mm-hmm.
the goodness and the grace and the attributes of Yahweh or God.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
One kind of closing question, kind of bringing it into our own kind of context. Obviously, we're living in a tumultuous time in our world.
To say the least.
Yesterday, a couple days ago, I guess we had the bombing in Libya that killed the shooting in Libya that killed the ambassador, and we see things in Egypt kind of unraveling a little bit too. And we know that a lot of what we see out there is undergirded at a minimum by different religious beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the notion of the Abrahamic faith earlier. I mean, how might we, as Christians living in South Carolina in the 21st century, how might we have an understanding of this history, of this covenant, and how might that understanding, what would be your hope for us, I guess, as Christians, and how we might live into that notion
Okay.
of covenant history?
Well, let me start with the bad news. The bad news is there's always the worst problems when you have closest relationships and families. Like, to give you an example the other night, during the war between the states, Civil War, however you want to call it, all the families were intimately affected, neighbors, etc., because they lived so close to each other. Jews, Christians, Muslims, it's the same God, many of the same teachings. Often the teachings are too close, and they are very much, there's more similarities than differences. So that's the difficulty, wanting to make distinctions and living intractably in many cases. The other hand is, it's incumbent upon those who want peace to demand it. To quote someone from a political party I may not be part of, just do it. Okay? It's time that people refuse, time that people stand up. It's time that news articles get shown, that networks tell the whole story, which they're not and haven't for years on either of the sides, to look for the similarities. And I'd liken it to, spoke to a couple groups lately, the play Lysistrata, the Greek tragedy. War stopped because the women refused marital relationships. And we've seen similar things happening with people, in a few cases, putting down their arms and saying no. If you go to the families, really do this, they don't want to be there. They don't want their children there. What's happening is a lot of this fermenting is happening in the West Bank and other places, and they're living under horrible, horrible conditions, and that's their way out. A bombing or something like that. It's understandable. It's terrible, but it's understandable. We've got to make those living situations better. There's got to be a way in which for the people to live together, to each have their own state and recognize each other. The Jews, Palestinians, however you want to call them. But it really takes a brave person to say no, to speak up, to vote. We've got elections coming up. And if after that you don't like the person, get them out. There's also an instrument for that. And when something happens, yell from the mountaintops that this is not going to be put up with. A wonderful movie many years ago, Network. open up a window, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. We need to be doing that. We live in a world that is so small now that so much can occur in so little time. The Arab Spring, for instance, is almost a ridiculous statement as to how much that involved and how many lives that touched and is touching in terrible ways and in wonderful ways. But really, the message right now is it's not going to happen on its own. It's not going to happen from the top down. It's not going to happen by governments because it's a piece of paper, it's a handshake, not going to work. It has to happen from grassroots, whether it's Christian, Muslim, or Jew. It really has to happen with the people and together with them. And it's doable. It's not easy, but it is doable.
And the way that, I guess, would tie back into our context here, especially as it relates to students, is, I guess, a good piece of advice for them is to use the opportunity they have while they're here to push themselves outside of those maybe comfortable places. To
absolutely.
Build friendships and relationships with people that are different from them.
Build relationships, not fences, to be a ridiculous example. Get involved, invite people. You see someone different, speak to them. You see an injustice, address it, and have other people help to address it. The civil rights never would have happened, movement never would have happened without grassroots, without religious teachings behind it also, with Gandhi and Martin Luther King picking up on them, etc. The roots are there. They're obviously there. The problem is people are taking advantage, co-opting, using religion as a way out, as a reason. And we just got to say no to that. Religion is a beautiful thing. I'll close sort of with a statement. I've never seen a teaching in any one of the major religions at all, the traditions, that is a problem. The problem is they all involve human beings. And when they get together, even on the smallest level, you have a church meeting, a synagogue, staff meeting, whatever, and it looks like a battlefield. But you multiply that out by lives and claim to the land. The Arab people have a claim to that land through Ishmael, and it comes up every year in the Knesset, in the parliament in Israel. Their claim through Abraham, through the other son, or through the other son and then Abraham. They think, and in many ways it is just as important. And Christianity, just as important. Within 1 acre, you have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Jesus' tomb and where he was crucified, the western wall, the last part of the Second Temple, the mosque that was built in the 8th century to Omar, the Dome of the Rock, which has the rock in which supposedly Isaac or Ishmael were put up for sacrifice. And the Garden of Gethsemane is about a few hundred yards in the other direction. And 12 years ago, war broke out because the Israeli prime minister wanted to go up on the Temple Mount. The Arabs didn't want him, but he went up anyway with army. And that's when the war broke out. We have to respect each other, and we have to demand peace. It's the only way it's going to happen.